then work towards the fiscal year 2025-34 CIP, taking into consideration the projects that have already been adopted here and started, and then considering what we can do in the out years. So really, this conversation for the long-range plan will hopefully set us up for success in the spring for the adoption of that CIP.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful. Again, we talked about tier 1, stage 1, tier 1, stage 2, stage 2, stage 5, stage, so what are those really meaning? And we wanted to take us back to this work. So this was the infographic that was shared early on in the project. And you can see the candy cane. Mark, that's what it looks like, a candy cane to me. I guess I'm already in that season. We are at stage 2 in the tier 1 section. So again, we are at the final project report and the data that are anticipated to be submitted at the end of September 2023. So that's where we are. And if you can see, I know people wanted to get a little bit ahead of it, but you can see the deeper dive, that portion does not happen until tier 2. And that does require school board support. And so that is something that if given that support, we will start those feasibility studies on facilities identified. So the FCA, the report, I love this one. No, that's my favorite one. It's broken down, as you can see here. So our FCA report is the overall summary of our buildings. And then it breaks down into 2 sections. On my left is facility condition index, and then building characteristics index. So both of those together make up the report. Then when we look at that and we break down our FCI a little bit further, we can go into our local projects, which are what we term our MCMM projects. And also our major infrastructure projects can be determined out of our FCI score. The FCI score, focuses on our systems infrastructures, and it's a ranking tool, industry-based ranking tool on the system age and the condition. And then our building characteristics, we looked at 3 categories: building systems, educational spaces, and common spaces, and creating that label there. So when we look at it, the building characteristics is where we find our deep dive for major facility renovations or reconstructions. But also you see that little dotted line between, sometimes depending on the scope of the major infrastructure project, it could fall into that deep dive category as well. So that is the structure of the FCA, and that will guide your understanding as we continue through the work. So when we look at the 3 areas that come out, the 3 categories that really come out to us with regards to our capital investment strategies, we have our local projects, which is what we call MCMM. And those are capital needs, typically under $500,000. We can schedule them over a fiscal year. Minimal disruption to the school environment, to the instructional environment, and it's like a localized project. When we look at major infrastructures, those capital needs can range between 500,000 and we estimated 15 million. It can schedule between 1 to 3 years, and that disruption can be a medium or major disruption, but I try to limit the major disruptions to the summertime or as well as those winter breaks. And before I continue, hold on, we have 2 more people to introduce. So go ahead, welcome, Libby. Just introduce.
Thank you. Yeah, Libby Garvey, Arlington County Board Liaison to JFAC. I was going to plan to sit quietly in the back.
Oh, no.
And just observe, but here I am. I'll try to be quiet at the table. It's nice to see everybody.
Hi, I'm Reed Goldstein. I'm a school board member, and I'm the school board liaison to the JFAC. And I also was planning to sit in the back just very quietly and observe, following Libby's lead.
Yeah, you and I are going to kibitz back there.
Yes, yeah.
So welcome to the conversation, to the table. And so just continuing in deep dive, as we talked a little bit about, is those major renovation reconstruction projects that can take a considerable amount of time. All right, sorry. So our methodologies for ranking based on capital investment strategies. When we look at those three buckets, so local projects, we tend to review our local projects within our minor construction, major maintenance grouping, which is a 10-year project list that we work to create. And I believe the work that MTFA has set us with has definitely put us in a good place to do that. So I do appreciate you again. You're gonna get shout outs like all evening, so I'm sorry if you're shy about that. And it also aligns our projects, helping us to reprioritize them based on their remaining useful life and identify their associated costs. So that's with local projects. When we look at our major infrastructure projects, the methodology around that is to prioritize our projects based on the FCI score, the system's remaining useful life, and the infrastructure type. Identifying, hopefully for our 2025-34 CIP work, 5 projects under this funding line. And then our major renovation and reconstruction projects, or the deep dive, is to prioritize based on educational space deficiencies with square footage of space taking the highest priority. So the difference between the deep dive group and the major infrastructure group, the major infrastructure group, again, prioritizes based on the FCI score and the system's remaining useful life. The deep dive, we're looking at educational space deficiencies and that square footage needed. Then we also, within that deep dive, review the common space deficiencies for facilities with the highest educational space facilities, then overlay that information with the FCI score for square footage deficiency ranking. And another thing with our renovation, major renovation projects, we do look at the capital investments that have happened in that facility over the last 20 years. And then in that work, we work to identify 5 to 10 facilities that we can recommend for staff to complete analysis and feasibility study for our fiscal 25-34 CIP. So within our major infrastructure ranking methodology, we do rank based on the FCI score that we take deferred maintenance first, and then we look at accumulated degradation. I said it correctly. We identified 5 schools based on the greatest FCI score and the fewest educational space deficiencies, and then rank those scores based on FCI, remaining useful life, and type of infrastructure required. Then we group those school projects rather than types of infrastructure projects. So we group the school projects together, and then we review that list of program and infrastructure projects. And when we look at the deep dive studies methodology, again, prioritizing on the educational space deficiencies with classroom square footage taking the highest priority, review common space deficiencies for facilities with the highest educational space deficiencies, overlay that with the FCI score, review capital investments, and then identify 5 to 10 facilities for deep dive. So we're going to take the time because Kathy is awesome with this. She is going to dive into the data.
So what we'd like to do is, where's my email?
Okay.
Is give the chairs the opportunity. So I know that you had a little chance to look at the data. And what we did at the committee of the whole last week was to offer this, our school board members, schools that they wanted to see, and then walk through the data. But we also received a set of very good questions from JFAC today. And we also wanted to leave some time to at least go over some of those questions so that we have an understanding and possibly, clarification so that we can better respond to some of your concerns. So would you like to walk through the data first?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to download it from the website just to make sure that it does work, right? So what it will do, because it's such a large file, it will download. It will not open. It's an Excel, and you will need Excel to open this file. So it's such a large file, it's not just going in the download. So
Swirl and swirl.
Well, I also gotta go local.
I gotta go local here. printed. All right. So also on the website are kind of an at a glance, kind of to give you an overview of the report. But the second link is we tried our best to walk through steps on how to navigate the data because it's a complex set of information. I think our consultants have done a fantastic job in the time to review 41 facilities based on the two categories that Renee had spoken about. So what you'll see here is really kind of a dynamic data set. So when you saw the report, it had a lot of appendices, and I know one of the questions are, well, where are the appendices? And that was like a choice, because when you add the appendices, the report becomes over 200 pages. And we felt like this data workbook, because it's dynamic, is a little bit easier to use than just looking at static appendix pages. So if you'd like, we can go by school, we can go by building characteristics, we can go by common space or educational space adequacies. But what's really important is this first tab is the navigation tab. It will get you to any type of data you'd like to look at for any school. But the other two important tabs are at the very end. And that is the definition for how the facility condition indexes are determined based on industry standard. And this is the definition of the industry standard that our team worked really hard to assess their facilities. The next criteria is the BC criteria. Oh, I love internet, but not when it's still not showing.
Probably too many of us on it.
So this is not going as well as last week, but here we go. So what you'll see is the building criteria, BC criteria, and it is organized by major building systems, common spaces, and educational spaces. And when you look here, you'll see not only the criteria that the consultants looked at, but the actual definition of that criteria, kind of the range that they looked at from 1 to 5, and then some of the notes they took as they went and assessed the facilities. So would you like to start the navigation page and pick a school to walk through?
I think I'm just looking at the tab for FCA conditions summary,
Okay.
Where it actually gives what appeared to be the FCI scores in total.
Mhm.
And so it might be useful to kind of start there, maybe work backwards across an individual school.
And I mean, I'm on the network here and then I might need to close some things. Some cooperating. See if it will get me back. This data set is so large. No, this is a local copy, but because it's projecting and I'm on the guest network. See if I can get back on the APS network.
And Dwayne says it's working. Work for you? While she's working on that, is there any question that we may have that the consultants here? Since that's question, that's a space filling.
Absolutely. So again, I'm Wells, I'm Vice Chair of JPAC. I first want to just, applaud both the staff and also the consultants for, all the work that they put into this. It's clear that this has been, not only a long running effort, but also one into which a lot of time and care has been put. So and the reports and the appendices, the data that we're hopefully going to be taking a look at in a moment are certainly evidence of that. I think a lot of the questions that JPAC has are a bit less about the report itself, though I'm happy to spend some time with it, just to make sure that we're clear about, what data was relied on and kind of what ultimately things like the FCI mean and what we can do with that. And more about, all right, so we have this report, we have the information in it. So what's the next step? What do we do with this in terms of figuring out which of the projects under major infrastructure and renovation to prioritize? And what's the criteria to kind of use for those? That might be beyond the scope of what we talk about here because it all, involves other stakeholders, but I think it's at least a good place to start.
Okay. I think I'm ready.
All right.
So do you want to go to the FCA condition summary? Is that the link you'd like to go to?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we jump here. I tried to make it larger for you to see, but now I guess I need to make it smaller so that it'll fit on screen. What would you like to review in this, on this tab?
So two things. First, am I reading it right that the building FCI column, the one with just the numbers and the left, that's the index that was calculated?
Yes.
So, and generally speaking, the higher the number, the closer it is toward one, the sort of worse shape that the building is in.
Correct.
All right. And we sort of see some of the, at least summaries of the metrics used for those and some of the other ones. So we've got foundation, slab, and we keep moving over. We see interior doors and other criteria for each school. They're listed by, kind of a stop sign or stoplight format.
Yep. Yes.
Anything else that's kind of useful to highlight for this one?
Yeah, so if we go back to the navigation tab, because this is a summary of all the schools,
Mhm.
correct? So to get more information per school, what you can do is go to the selected building to generate a report. And if you go to the systems details report, so I selected Campbell, actually I'll select Swanson because we received a message that some of the schools weren't working. And I want to allay people's fears that they are working, that the report does work. So we jump to Swanson. What you'll see is what you saw in the FCA summary, but by school, right? So at the top here, you will see the FCI AD, which is the accumulated degradation. So that's over time, what that school's score is, right? The one that's a little bit more short-term and might need more attention is your FCI DM, deferred maintenance. What has immediate needs right now? And so that's what you look at. And as you said, it's green, yellow, and red. And then that scale, I don't know if people can see it, make it larger. So if you look at the good is 0 to 0.15, and the poor goes from 0.331 to 1. And the reason it's a fraction is really because it's that industry standard of deferred maintenance or accumulated degradation over the actual current replacement value for that system. If it's an HVAC system, it's a lighting system, how much is that current replacement value?
And I would take it that the replacement value is higher, sort of like older or more efficient the current part of the facility is.
So do you want to address the current replacement value?
Sure, the current replacement value doesn't take into account basically age of the system. It's just the system itself. So the boiler will still cost a boiler, whether it's 10 years or 20 years old. So, but it's the overall cost of those systems in present dollars.
Okay.
Right, in $2023. Yeah.
So in other words, if there's a need identified for a certain kind of system, you then factor in, all right, what will essentially be the value of whatever's necessary to bring the system kind of current.
Correct. So when you factor in age, that's when you start talking about estimated useful life, and that could factor into whether you have, a good, fair, or poor condition, that could weigh in with the actual condition itself.
Right, so if you see these last two columns, as Matt has said, so EUL is expected useful life of that system, and RUL is the remaining useful life. So if you noticed in the main report, sorry, I don't want to give anyone a headache. So if you noticed in the main report, there were some schools listed based on their FCI score for deferred maintenance in terms of which schools were ranked poor and fair. So we go to the one school that was ranked poor. We got a really good question from Cal last week. You'll see that its actual deferred maintenance came up as red. And, the question was, well, it really only has one red item. Why is it red? And that one red item is its built-up roof because its remaining useful life, it only has about 2 years remaining. But as you go slowly through this data, you'll notice that while they don't have a lot of reds, they do have some building systems that only have about 3 years remaining useful life. And as you add those all up, that's how it contributes to that FCI score for deferred maintenance.
So now I'm going to ask a couple of questions too.
Of course.
So as far as the remaining useful life goes, it doesn't necessarily mean that you got to tear a school down and build it back up. It basically goes into one of those 3 buckets. HVAC's bad, you replace an HVAC. But if you have a building that say doesn't have the right floor space or the right specs for actually accommodating students, that's where we get into that 3rd bucket where there's actually a need to really disrupt a student population. Correct.
So.
I think the thing, oh, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just gonna say, I think the thing to clarify the distinction between what you're talking about and what we're looking at right now is this is FCI, which is just systems agent condition.
Right.
So when you start talking about floor space or programmatic needs or certain specifications for the educational use of the buildings, that falls into those BCI categories,
Right.
which is the building characteristics that we haven't gotten to in detail yet. But those are two separate sets of data.
Sure. So
And-
this is not the deep dive stuff necessarily. It could be, but not, so Williamsburg in the red doesn't mean that we're in the bucket of deep dive necessarily. It just means that it's age. Second question is, when you did the analysis, we had kind of thrown around the concept of when the FAC was actually advising APS on whether or not to do this, weighting certain criteria over others. And again, I realize this is just specs versus, in accordance with building codes. When you get into the intersection, or when we get into their section, was any consideration given to weighting, say, an HVAC over 500 square feet of space?
No waiting. And so during the CAL last week, what we presented to school board members are, the next step would be methodologies. So staff presented methodologies for ranking projects based on the facility condition index that would then inform us of projects under major infrastructure. Staff also presented a methodology for ranking or prioritizing facilities based on the building characteristics index, right? And so those methodologies were presented. We answered questions on them. And so the next step, and I think that was a request for both your committees, is look at those methodologies. Do they make sense? Methodologies are going to have biases, right? Some people would prefer to look at building systems or air quality over educational space deficiencies, like is there enough square footage per classroom for that school, right? And so staff determined a set of methodologies, but it's, we're sharing that with the two committees to say, does it make sense? Is that the best approach? Knowing, again, when we share our CIP that has already been adopted, the funding streams that we have currently available, right?
Is there a slide that organizes all of the various building systems by, I guess by rating? Like, in other words, would it be possible to have a tab in the spreadsheet that shows us just the ratings of one, at least for certain kinds of building systems like roofs? Because that seems like it could help us identify at least which of those individual projects, like the Williamsburg roof, that could, merit a specific fix outside of just a whole building renovation.
That's something that's something that staff's gonna be doing, am I wrong? In terms of the racking and stacking?
Right, so we would look through all the facility condition index score, yes, and we would do it by both systems and by school. That's what we have been spending the last few weeks on, just to make sure not only if we understand it well enough to help explain it, but also to go through it like you said. So, but there is not, the FCA condition summary is the best opportunity, like you saw, to kind of look at all the schools, look at their building systems and see what pop up. The other helpful thing that staff has done is, as we've gone through this and looked at the three categories that Renee has talked about, when we look at major infrastructure, we also share this with our maintenance team when they do their MCMM projects as well as infrastructure project. And we're like, does this make sense to you? Because a roof could have 3 years of remaining useful life. However, it could still be in a decent condition and they're not experiencing challenges with it, right? Whereas another roof maybe only has 5 remaining useful life on there, but they're really struggling. So we also overlay that as we're looking at this data.
The money that you're available for MCMM, as an example, is in the current CIP right now, because it's year of moving forward. And then when you start talking about major renovations, is that also included in the current CIP, or is that going to be included in the CIP guidance looking forward for new funding?
For major renovations. So that is, that's the big decision right now.
Okay.
As we present our methodologies and together we determine which methodology to use as we prioritize it. The next step would be to prioritize what we presented to the school board, 5 to 10 projects to do that feasibility study, like that deep dive, which we've done in the past for our design and construction team to help us set up for a project, right? So that's the next step. I mean, we could do 5 to 10. I know one of the questions from JFAC was 3 to 5 because of looking at our CIP, right? And the funding stream.
What was the question from JFAC?
I will bring that up too.
Yeah, the question was basically, should we reduce the number of feasibility studies in order to free up more CIP funds for kind of doing other projects in the shorter term?
Like major infrastructure projects.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think
By
the,
reducing,
the facility study and the feasibility study for these projects is not that significant cost. You know, I think you're looking at 250 to 500,000 per study, depending on the building and the building size and all of that. And so, you know, our thought process is we want to look at multiple projects because what we're going to be doing with this facility study or feasibility study is we're going to be looking at options to solve as many of the issues that arose on this study, whether it's the facility condition index or it's the educational facility issues. And how can you solve the majority of these? Because you can't solve every problem necessarily, but you can solve a huge portion of them. And maybe it's an addition, maybe it's a replacement, maybe it's a full renovation, and we'll be putting dollars to all of those. And the reason we want to create as many as we can, as we have done in the past, when we were looking at growth, is to provide the board with the options and the spread to look at, you know, here's some $30 million options, here's a $120 million option. You know, well, we have funding available, we can do 3 of these, but only 1 of those, you know, and that kind of thought process is to provide that kind of data. How do we want to move forward idealistically with our facilities, you know, and, you know, do we want to enlarge them? For instance, our elementaries with new, we've been going between 700 and 750 for capacity. And we have a lot of facilities that are a lot smaller than that. So how does that impact? So we want to make sure that we provide as much data to the board so that when they create the next CIP, how do we set this up for the long term? I mean, if you recall in the probably 4 back with single years we had looking at 3 elementary schools on the CIP. 1 was actually projected in the future and beyond the 10 years. But because of the growth, we thought we needed to do that. And that's the kind of balance. And that's where the dollars get involved, where we start looking at bonding capacity and how much funding is actually available.
so Jeff, a couple of questions on that. You do feasibility studies all the time.
Mhm.
So we do those as a matter of course. The second thing is, if I'm not mistaken, Reed said this in the last meeting when we were at the JFAC, that we haven't done one of these. There used to be a 25-year cycle. They look at all the schools and kind of go through all the refreshes. This is the first one, 10 or 15 years, because we were in a growth cycle. So now you're effectively making up lost ground for all the studies that didn't get done over time.
Yeah, and a lot of that we're doing with major infrastructure. I mean, you can make a huge improvement on the FCI of a project just by replacing its roof or replacing its HVAC system. I mean, right now we're doing Barcroft HVAC system, but that also includes the lighting. That's also going to include finishes. That also is going to include some casework. So I mean, it's more than just the HVAC system. And I think the other thing you have to look at is with replacement cost, it's replacement cost. But are we looking to upgrade and change the systems to be more sustainable and that kind of thing? And that's a different dollar and cents, which we would look at as part of this type of project. And you're looking for a replacement of an HVAC system with all those other things, you're somewhere between $8 and $15 million. So where does that fall?
Just as a thought, because I keep seeing the 0.012 and I'm a physicist, so like that goes with my brain, but it doesn't go with most people's brains. When you get into the decimal places and you go up, to get worse. That is not a framework that most people work with. So I would encourage you to go onto some sort of 100-point scale. And also when you get into good, bad, good, fair, you know, some scale that makes sense, and worse is low or worse is high, it doesn't matter, but it's very clearly delineated. And then when you get into good, fair, bad, someone's gonna take a look at this report and say Williamsburg needs to be torn down, it's red. And so we gotta, I'm just saying, like, we
Well,
have to
that's why
clarify.
we really ask, and we understand it, it's a lot of information, it takes time. You cannot just, I mean, it took us time, you know, and then we would always check, is that a good understanding? Like, we would reach back out to the consultants because anyone can rush through this process, it's not gonna be helpful to anybody, right? But I think what they've done here is really give us an opportunity to look at different types of projects we can pursue. It's not just one project, like a major renovation, right?
Yeah.
And I think we are able to explain, like, based on the facility condition index, it's an industry standard. And I know decimal points can be challenging sometimes to understand what's, you know, the better or the worse. But because it's an industry standard, I think we can explain it. And then we can show through the report, while Williamsburg is identified as something that has some deferred maintenance needs, which we understand, because if you look at what we've done in the last several years, we've touched a good handful of elementary schools, we've touched our comprehensive high schools, our secondary program. We really haven't done a lot of love and care at the middle school levels for some of the middle schools, right? It's not surprising that that information has come up.
Yeah.
Right, so we just need to be able to explain it.
Don't take me wrong. I know that all 41 schools have deficiencies likely. And I'm simply saying, when you put something, like you have a technical side and you have a 3-color code thing, when you're explaining, because I know you will, just making sure that people understand Williamsburg is red because the roof is approaching its useful life. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
Right, so let's go back into the data, but I also.
Can I just jump in here? I've got some people in the back are having trouble hearing. So if collectively we can raise our level of projection, it would be appreciated.
Okay, so let's go in that data to look at Williamsburg, just as you would say, and then I don't know if you want to, but Wells, we put all your questions into slides because it helped us understand it.
Sounds good.
And we can go over that and have a good conversation too, so that at least we know what our next steps are, right? And addressing some of your concerns or questions. So let's go to Williamsburg, Kelly. Oh, we're here. All right. So you saw the system detail report, which was focused on the facility condition index. So that's the building systems, right? And we went down and we showed you which systems probably needed some love and care. So if we go back though to the navigation page, what we should go to is the educational spaces. So it's the third under action. It's this third link here, building characteristics, educational spaces. So you'll see all the schools listed here based on the different categories of building characteristics that were evaluated for each school, okay? And you'll see red, green, yellow, and then different numbers. So unfortunately, actually, let's change the view so we can see the heading so I can highlight it for you. If we go to Williamsburg here, which I'll highlight here in gray, you'll see that, and this is just the first category of educational spaces, which is, does this school have adequate square footage for its classrooms? Okay, Williamsburg has 38 that meet educational space criteria, and only 8 that do not meet. That's actually great, right, for a school. Whereas if you go to Jefferson, you'll kind of see the reverse, right? And so that's that right-hand pathway. When you have to look at the methodologies for evaluating the building characteristics, what should we look at first, second, third, as we make that prioritization to see really what schools need to be looked at first?
Just, that's really helpful. And looking at this and comparing it to what we just looked at before, it seems like one of the themes that comes out is that the is it looking at the specific characteristics of the building, so the HVAC system, the roof, that can help us identify, spot projects for these more limited renovations. Whereas space is really hard to adjust without, more of a kind of down to the studs and more kind of work.
Correct, exactly. And that's how we would love you to look at this data, and there is a lot of information, and I know we're all pressed for time. I mean, we were scrambling just to make sure we understood it well enough to be able to explain it. So yeah, we would appreciate if you looked at it and say, okay, this methodology might be the best, like, the square footage of the educational spaces, like which schools have the least, and you'll see that we have some ones, some that with only one green. And, so then do we do less than 5, greater than 10? Those are methodologies, right?
Well,
And that's what we've played around with.
And I think the thing is that our facilities are very different and have different areas of good versus not as good. None of our facilities are completely off the chart bad. As a lot of schools, and I'm sure we've all been reading about nationally about the condition of school facilities. Ours are not in that case. It's a degree of condition.
Either that way, right?
Well, I mean, we had 10 years of growth that roofs were not done and HVAC systems were not replaced because everything was being put into the growth and making sure that we had seats. We're in the process of trying to get back on that. Now, of course, we're out of sync for 10 years. It's going to take 20 years to get us, back to where we really want to be and having it just a general, cycle of repair and replacement, and that kind of thing. But I did want to bring up, for instance, Taylor, the elementary school from a condition report is really good. I mean, it has the geothermal system in it, and that gives it all kinds of good ratings. But if you look at its condition educationally, it's not as rosy. So I think we look at all of these and they're so different and it is apples, oranges, grapes, kumquats. I mean, it's all across the board, and we have to look at that and try to put something together in a logical fashion for the board to consider. So they're the ones who are going to make the decision as to what the priorities are and how they want to do that. We spent a lot of time going through trying to set up the framework for this and talking about it. And we really came down to the conclusion at this point, we didn't want to make priorities and set it up and wait it because we wanted to allow it to come out and see what the conditions were of things we thought were going to affect. Some things we thought were going to be horrible across the board are green. Things that we thought were going to be just great. We got a lot of reds. So, I mean, there was some surprises, but in general, I think it was a really good way to pull it all together. And we're looking at everything on equal footing. And then we're trying to look at it at a criteria now that we set it up to give the board to make a logical assessment, of.
Do you want to go through your questions?
Yeah, so because we could take all night on the data. It's a data geek and we can stay there, but wanted to give an opportunity too to make sure that for questions we can address. Some questions we can at this time because board is still contemplating and deciding direction. But as we go through them, let us know if we kind of touched on it or if you would like some deeper conversation. And Kelly, if you see something that you want to add or piggyback on the questions as well. Also, Libby, Bree, Mary, if you all have questions, this is your opportunity.
So I want to thank you both, you and Stacy, for sending these questions. I thought they were very thoughtful and that you really, spent time just kind of at least understanding at the higher level what this data was trying to represent. So I put them all on slides and so we can go through them. And like Renee said, there might be some questions. We will just need to get back to you, and we'll try to consolidate that all together.
Great.
Okay.
And if I could just jump in, I want to make sure Kelly and Cynthia, if the FAC members have questions that aren't reflected in this list, that we also build in some time. So
Absolutely.
please jump in.
So I think we talked a little bit about like how should or will different building characteristics be weighed, right? So we talked about if we go down that right path for that feasibility study, the deeper dive, we're gonna have to present a methodology, right? And then that's really gonna determine how we're gonna rank and prioritize. With the left pack, with the facility condition index, it's a little bit more straightforward because we have that score. And then we can also work to see with our team what's already on tap to be, to go on for major infrastructure.
So I think one follow-up on that is, whether you can give a preview of some of the criteria that you might use in weighing different things. So I mean, with the facility, index, it's straightforward, right? It's a rank score. You've got between 0 and 1. And so naturally you kind of say, all right, well, let's start with the highest score, the worst, and then kind of go from there. But even within that, there's a lot of variation. We talked about Williamsburg, for example, where, it may well be that one aspect or two aspects of Williamsburg could be appropriate for including, but there also could be some other buildings that might have a lower score, but they have more across the board problems.
Right.
And so can you give, at least some, us the benefit of your thinking about how you might, suggest weighing those different things? Like, would a roof be more important than an HVAC, or would, a single school with a really acute need kind of weigh more or prioritize higher than a school with, many more but less acute needs?
Yes, so I think that's a really good point. So roofs are definitely one of our highest priorities, right? Because if you don't have a tight building envelope, water is probably our biggest enemy anywhere. So yes, they would rank higher, and we will then probably write that out in terms of how you've asked that question. Like, what are the building systems that kind of staff looks at to rank? And I think Jeff alluded to this too. We had started a schedule where we would replace 2 roofs a year, right? Because we have about 41 facilities, and if a roof lasts about 20, 25 years, we should be out of schedule. However, because of growth, in the last few years, 10 years, we did not keep up with that schedule. And that's probably, that is reflected in the data that we see, so.
And I think that one of the things too is to answer your question, it's complicated. I think that we need to look at those facilities that have the red, that are in the red, and evaluate why is it in the red and how can we fix it? Not necessarily like, for instance, a roof. Sometimes the roof has reached its useful life, but the membrane is still good. But we could probably get another 10 years out of it, if we go redo flashings and do the seams. So we can look at those types of options with some of those roofs, and maintenance does do that anyway. So with this list, they're probably going to go out and look at some of these things from that standpoint, because it gets you additional life, it buys you additional time. I think all of our HVAC systems, we went through during COVID and maximized and got the most out of the systems that we have. And probably have done some repairs, but, maintaining that is critical, but I think when you start talking about what are the priorities, I would say your envelope of a building is one of your number one priorities, because again, moisture is going to create bad air quality if you get moisture in the building. But the HVAC, the HVAC systems also need to be taken care of from that standpoint. But if all of that stuff works really great and you don't have the educational environment, it's a school.
Cynthia?
So can I just get a clarification here? Is that option for flashings, for example, is that only revealed with a deep dive, or whenever anything codes in as a red, you're gonna start asking yourself?
I think what we're going to have to do, and, because everything is different, is for us to come up with criteria that we're going to be looking at and how we're going to be looking at these facilities. And then we have to go look at the facility. From an educational standpoint, we also have to look at, sometimes operational things, the way a building was designed. For instance, we do have some new buildings that show red, in the educational environment. But that was because it doesn't match our standard ed spec, because they do some things a little different. So we have to look at that and say, why is it red? So we take 10 of them, we look at them, do an evaluation before we get to the CIP. And I think that.
Right, so the 5 and the 10 were the deep dive, right?
For the major renovation, because I don't want us to stay on the right side, because there's a lot that can go on the left side for the local projects. And we already have that data there, that it tells us we know the remaining useful life. So for me, we would look at that information as well, but you wanted.
I'm just trying to simplify it. Well, I don't know, maybe you've all got it. I mean, I get the general thing, but I've heard
Mhm.
many times we have to decide what our, how we're gonna look at this and the priorities. So are we to go away from this if there's still you as staff needing to decide how you're going to, implement this great framework that we have here, right? Because we understand how the buckets are, how you got red dots. So to your point, what is the next step? What are you gonna do with red dots? So I've
So I
heard a
think
couple
the
of times that you're still deciding on how you will move forward. So, okay, if you've decided,
Well, so the Cal presentation from last week and the presentation that Renee just gave shared a methodology for both in major infrastructure and major renovation. And I think, based on the email from Mary to FAC, was for the committees to look at those methodologies to see if that's the right approach or to give some recommendations on different methodologies.
okay, Jeff, then can you just repeat, you just said we need to decide on how we're gonna look at this stuff.
That's what I was talking about, the methodologies. And right now, we're looking at an overlay of all of the different brackets.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is, and this goes back to the advisory roles that our committees play, is you have a methodology and or an alternative, and part of our work, Mary shared this already, is to look at whether or not those methodologies are sound and will they, with public comment, how will they be used to move forward? But what I'm also hearing, reading between the lines, is it's not going to be a 1 through 41 ranking of which school to do next. Many of these projects, most of them, will not be tear a school down and build another one back up. They will be spread out over time, where a roof is fixed this summer and 3 years from now, you all get a new HVAC system, so on and so forth, with pretty much the building footprint remaining the same, knock a wall out, whatever.
And it will be dictated on your buckets of funding. So,
And I think if you want to jump ahead, and I think, JFAC had asked this question regarding projects. So it was like 5 years down the road here. So how will the CIP account for the funding and timing of all the recommended feasibility studies? In particular, if you do some deep dive studies in the early years, should there be a stipulation or placeholder for funds and timing to do more in the coming years, 5 to 6 years? I think what we've seen from this extensive data is we want this to be a living document, and that every 5 years we revisit it and we update it, and then we see what other projects need another feasibility study so that we can then program those projects for major renovation. So yes, we are kind of in alignment with what your question is. We need to figure out what that looks like, but we hope that this data, as we said, is dynamic now, remains dynamic.
Kathy, can I ask a question about that? So let's assume let's say that that lower right-hand corner box is fixed in general. Everyone's got good air, everyone's got most of the educational space and footprint that they need. Boundary adjustments, though everyone hates them, can be made to, shape the student population where they need to go into 41 schools that we have. Is the goal then at some point for this dynamic database to then kind of move in those other two buckets continuously with the footprints that we have, and that's it, instead of building new schools constantly, it's just refresh, rebuild.
I think the goal is really to have a dynamic facility inventory management system. It's something that some of our staff have asked for a long time, and we see this as an opportunity to build on that. So, yes. Yes.
can I just ask, you said, 5 years. Is there a reason that the 5-year, window to go out and look again was picked at, because CIPs are every 2 years? So is there a reason that this 5-year refresh of your data is?
So, well, I'll let you all talk, because that was a recommendation for us to revisit
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the level of effort involved in performing the evaluations. I mean, we've been working on this since this time last year, and it's a significant undertaking with significant effort and cost. And I think that level of effort doesn't have the same value if you do it every single year. It can be more comprehensive. I think the intent of having that living database, though, is as these projects are undertaken, it can be updated to meet the update of the project. So if you replace a roof at Williamsburg, you can go in and update that information without having to go out and survey it. You know what's been done. So when you combine those two things, you know, the ability to update it as projects are carried out over 5 years. And then 5 years is about the amount of time that you would start to get away from an expectation of what we saw this year. Once you get beyond that 5 year period, things start to go different directions. But we have a pretty good idea now on the current condition and the expected useful life over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's why that recommendation is.
So question on the dynamic database, speaking of funding and things that get funded in CIPs. So, you know, where I work, we use customer relationship management tool, dynamic database, right? Do you have is there a set of software that does this instead of Excel spreadsheets? Is there something that is actually dynamic and industry standard?
So this is our vision. We're still working on it internally as
Not that
staff.
this is bad, this is amazing, just.
So we have a geographic information system. We would love to have all our facilities within that GIS system, with floor plans, with indications of equipment, with indications of all this data in that system. We've been thinking about this for a while. It's a big idea. But I think it would be helpful for all of us as we manage more and more facilities.
Are there any other proof concepts that would show that is I mean, just from a data perspective, it seems like it would be a money saver to have that, because also, you know, people retire, people move, you forget. And this was always a problem with Excel, is once you delete a box and move a new one in, you forget what happened in the old box. I'm just thinking if we want to make cost savings in future years. that might be something
It's an
worth trying.
expensive undertaking. I've worked with people that have had a GIS system and again, it got ignored for 2 years. And then you've got huge catch up to do. And I think sometimes just doing a new study similar to this every 5 years, sometimes refreshes you in a different way.
Yeah.
The data is really good for at least 5 years. You know, you might be able to push it to 6 because you're looking at and you're planning on based on the data that you have.
It's not that both shouldn't be done, it's just looking at, maybe analysis of alternatives on what might be a cost saving, and just I don't want to derail the meeting with talking about the GIS system, but it does seem like it's one of those capital investments that may not fix a school, but it may.
It can, but you again have to hire people to manage it and to keep it updated, and that's a huge effort. You know, and I'm not downplaying because I think they're fabulous. I've seen them work. But I've also seen them work in private industry where they have the capital put into it and it makes sense if they have a plant that's not operating optimally. You know, and it should be the same in school, but it's a huge undertaking. So I think this is a good stopgap that we have. And I think we'll continue I think we don't need to do it every year, but I think we have the data to further everything for the next 5 years. And we may have different criteria that come to light 5 years from now.
So let's try to good questions. I know there's so much discussion.
Did you have a question? I know we have their posted
Yeah.
questions. Was there a question from, I'm gonna kind of try to go back?
No, I'm happy to go through their questions unless Cynthia has more questions. We went through the data. We also helped recommend the criteria, so I think we're a little like a step ahead of JFAC just by design. And so these questions all make sense to me. As far as this goes, the only big thing I wanted to know about, and Mary already provided it, is what do you need from us, and how are we going to help evaluate the methodology, and then what are we going to do going forward with our work for the rest of the year? Thank you.
One area that might be helpful to go to is the last slide with the last few questions. So we're talking a little bit about cadence, and that also relates back to our earlier discussion with if there are any trade-offs between the sort of deep dive studies and also the metro infrastructure project. I sort of heard that there's not, at least in staff thinking, there's not much of a trade-off there simply because each feasibility study doesn't cost very much. You get to a trade-off, I guess, when you get to enough studies. And so is your thinking there that there's, 5 or 10 studies that you want to do, and then that's your kind of hard cap, you need the rest of the money for actual projects? Or is it that 5 or 10 gives us, a kind of reasonable range of the sort of buildings and long-term big picture projects that are really important, such that the 11th or the 12th doesn't give you much marginal value? So can you share kind of how you came up with the 5 to 10 range for the?
I think it's based on experience, and we're looking at how we've done the feasibilities in the past. And once you get beyond 5 to 10 projects in a CIP, 5 to 10 partly is thinking about the fact of the HVAC project plus in there too. So, you look at that and how much could you really fit into a CIP? We know that we've got a funding challenge coming in front of us with regard to the next CIP. But if you have 5 to 10, the board can look at the different priorities and how this could fit together, because it really is a puzzle to put the dollars and, available with the dollars needed. And you may end up flipping a project just because this project's less expensive and it can go here. But if we move it to this year, 2 years down the line, maybe a higher priority, but it fits into the budget that way.
So I think, staff too are still going through that, because I think we have different opinions, right?
Right.
Especially looking at our current CIP and then what we're going to plan for 25, 34. Does 5 to 10 make sense, or 35, as you had asked, because of our funding availability and the extensiveness of these projects, right? So we don't know.
And this should be my last question on this one before we move on, but we're talking a little bit earlier about the cadence of these sorts of studies. And one of the objectives, I suppose, would be to make sure that there's a pipeline, right? That's, by the time there is both the kind of need and also the funding available for a project, that you've got the design study ready to go to say, here's what you should actually do. And then you can put the forward with that option. Are there advantages to doing a different cadence, like doing, say, first few studies on more of like a 2, 3, or 4 year cadence? 2 to 4 years might make sense if you're trying to align it with each CIP. Such that if it's on a 4 year cadence, you've got, a certain number of studies kind of every other CIP, or you can kind of break it up by, 2 year blocks. I guess it also depends on how long each study is expected to take. But I guess my question is, was there consideration given to, instead of doing kind of the first half of the studies and the first 5 years, kind of breaking those up across multiple years, even within those first 5?
Yeah, I think you can do that. I think the other thing is if you have all these studies that are done, you can pull some back in 2 years and reevaluate it because of different conditions, those kinds of things. So I think looking at all of the facilities we think have needs, and they're different needs, but they seem to be rising to the top of the ones that we need to address or look at first. So I think that's what we're trying to do, and set that up. And then, the board changes, and board maybe have a different priority 2 years from now than they have right now. And we want to, allow that evolution to happen, and we had the data, and we do go back to a lot of the old studies that we've done and have gone back, and we evaluate. We say, well, we had this option, dollars aren't right today, but this is a way to look at it. And it also helps inform a future study. So it's good from a lot of perspectives.
I'm not sure you're suggesting this, but I also kind of hear that more information is better, right? So if you front load the studies by doing more of them in the earlier years, that sets the board up with more options later on.
It does, and it also lets you say, oh my God, this is a 10-year CIP, but we need to be thinking 20 years down the road. And it does allow you to realize that there's more coming down the road. You're going to have to think about how do you address that. Or you may also look at it and go, maybe we need to just get a whole lot more roofs and HVAC projects in the pipeline. I mean, a good example of that right now is the vestibules, the security vestibules. You know, the board front loaded that, we put that in. We had, I think, 8 kitchens, you know, we put that into place and into play. And I think the next CIP, we need to say, you know, we got more rooms. Last CIP, we looked at the infrastructure. That infrastructure number of dollars is higher than it's ever been in recent memory. And then we actually increased it every year of the 10-year CIP. Is it enough? Probably not, but I think that has to be looked at as well. And, you know, MCMM is typically funded out of the budget. You know, maybe MCMM should have a capital improvement number in the CIP, because there are capital improvements that can be made by under $500,000 that are going to last 15 to 20 years. That may be bond money versus operating fund money to take care of more issues and concerns.
Can I change gears on this?
Yeah, I just want to take a quick time check. So we have 25 minutes left. So yes.
I have 3 questions. I had about 5 of these questions. Can you go to the next slide?
To the next slide,
Yeah.
forward progress.
So this came up in the JPAC meeting the last time we were in there as well, this idea that we know we have declining student enrollment, this surplus of 1,900 seats at the elementary, 600 at the middle school, and 1,200 at the high school level. Yeah, I mean, I can remember 2 years ago, we had signs all over the place that said we need to put comprehensive high school now. So again, are those numbers accurate in the question, or are they not? And then the second question, this is one of the, I was asking at the JPAC, is where are they? Because they're not at one school. There's 2 here, 10 there. You know, there's not a really good way to solve that, even if there are, you know.
So there's an opportunity. It requires some. So we do publish our September 30th enrollment data. We also, under that same statistics page, have the design capacity for each school. So you are able, should you bring up both sheets of information, to see what capacity may exist right now. So are you asking that staff verify this number?
No, I'm not
Okay.
necessarily. What I'm asking is that, so a couple of things. Are those trailers or not?
No,
So those are just seats in an actual physical brick and mortar
right.
building?
So if you look again, do you want me to pull up the statistics?
No, I just
So if you
high
look
level,
at
like,
the statistics page with the facility capacity, that is, you'll see capacity for the building. And then you also can see that for the enrollment data. So yes.
because that gets at the underutilization and, got it. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
This question right here. So I was surprised that the board backed off on this. They backed off on boundaries as well. Not saying you backed off, just paused or said that it was not needed any longer necessarily now that the data is out. Could you expand on this?
I think that, Mary said it very well last week, is that while we all know that swing space is extremely helpful, and it has been helpful to us in the past, what, consideration that was needed first before deciding on swing space is something we haven't done since early 80s, and that is closing a school. Closing a school is, challenging. And so we need to come up with policies or at least guidelines on how you go about closing a school. So back in the 80s, the guideline was that if a school had less than 2 classrooms per grade, then they should be considered for closing in terms of its capacity and utilization of that space.
Was this in a time of declining enrollment as
It
well?
was at a time of that declining enrollment, and there were several candidates at that time. And when they went through that process, only one school was closed, and that was Marina.
The reason I asked that, because if you go back 2 slides now to the slots that are supposedly open in our school system, you know, just looking at the old plan, I'm not advocating in any way for it. I'm just saying, when you are going to close Nottingham and the north has an abundance of seats, you're going to combine those schools, that would have filled those schools back up, obviously to the detriment of the community in Nottingham. But this goes back to that overcapacity. So is that a real overcapacity? Is it something that we have to consider at some point, or is it not an issue right now?
Yeah, I just, I'll add a thought and then my colleague here, Reed, wants to speak as well. So I think what I have learned in the past month in going through these different steps to get to tonight is a couple of things. So one is sort of an order of operations question, right? That when the recommendation was made last spring, that Nottingham, there was a recommendation in the pre-CIP report, right? That said Nottingham should be repurposed by 2026 for swing space. What I think, that was before we got this facility condition report. And coupled with looking at the funding available in the CIP, there is not actually funding available. Number one, the facility information we just got within the past month gives us a good sense of the things that are in that major renovation bucket, that list of schools that, you know, when we're talking about educational space and not just systems, where we might need to do some major reconstruction or renovation. However, we won't know the specifics of that until the feasibility studies get done. So in an order of operations sense, right, it's getting this inventory, which we now have. It's looking at that data and coming up with the list of what feasibility studies need to be done, this 5 to 10. You were going to pick the ones off the top. And then after we have the feasibility studies, knowing whether or not swing space is needed. So in that order of operations, when we get those feasibility studies back, we will have a better sense of whether those projects can be accomplished by phasing construction, by building a new building next to an old one, as was done at Wakefield, or swing space. We know that swing space would be faster and there would be cost savings associated with that. So at the time the board gets those feasibility studies back, we will be able to make a more informed decision about whether swing space is needed and what options should be on the table for that. I don't think, when we talked last week in the committee of the whole, I don't think that it is the board's sense that we want to take completely off the table the idea of repurposing one of our existing schools, particularly given the excess capacity we're talking about here. But as Kathy mentioned, as I was trying to bring up last week, if our approach is going to be to take an existing school community, close the school, which essentially what we were talking about doing, and using that building for swing space, there are a variety of considerations that we would need to proactively plan for that I don't know that we were fully prepared to execute on at this time. So I think you would need to have that conversation, but for this CIP, it is not looking like we will be in a position to, to flip the lever on one of these major reconstruction renovation projects. That would be teed up for the 2026 CIP. So I think based on the information that's come to me, that is how I understand it. And that's sort of where we are with swing space. But Reed, if you have a different interpretation of that, jump in.
I don't have a different interpretation, but I have a related question, I guess. And that is, I don't understand what the relationship is between the major infrastructure projects and the long-range renovation projects. The major infrastructure projects, at the COW last week, you detailed 5 of them. And superintendent said, or we came to the conclusion that we would not be needing swing space to do the infrastructure, those 5 infrastructure projects.
That's correct.
Should they be built into the upcoming CIP, the June 24 CIP. What's the relationship between those 5 and the other potential renovation projects? Are they renovation light? Are they plans that you've had in your head to do for several CIP cycles, you know, prior to this long-range renovation exercise. So I don't really understand what they are and why don't they need deep dive studies?
So, well, two of them are already on staff's radar that they're designed, and that was Escuela Key and Dorothy Ham, if I'm not mistaken. So that's already been in the works with the major infrastructure. As we, a few slides ago, we shared that major infrastructure projects, the way staff work to design them, they work to design them so that there's a medium level of disruption during the school year with the major disruptions happening during the summertime and during the winter. So our kitchens are some of our vestibules, most of our vestibules, a lot of our vestibules we completed over the winter break. I know we had a couple that came over the summer, some that are trickled into the school year. So it's caused a medium level of disruption. So with major infrastructure, we try not to disrupt. So we don't see, at this point in time, staff has reviewed major infrastructure projects so that swing space is not a needed consideration for major infrastructure projects. Now, as Jeff has definitely educated me on feasibility studies, a piece of the feasibility study that we really didn't focus on, but we should, is that we talk about the conditions and requiring swing space. And then what do those conditions look like? That comes out in the study. Is that a relocatable village? Is that another building? You know, can you do it on the campus with a relocatable village? Probably, but that, you know, brings up cost as well when you look at the number of relocatables that are needed and the maintenance for that, depending on how long you need them. So that's information that we provide you as the board, so that as we're going down that road, we're providing you all the information needed. The recommendation was for swing space needed by 2026. In fairness, staff we don't have anything to present to you right now that requires swing space in 2026. We have to be honest, we don't have that. Not to say that and you notice everything we say, staff will let you know if and when it is needed. So based on those feasibility studies, it's not to say, please don't take this as we never need swing space. That's not what we're saying. It's just that based on the recommendation that we were made aware of, do we need it by 2026? Not at this time, no, sir.
Because the major infrastructure projects, if I hear you right, are designed to be less disruptive.
Designed to be less disruptive.
Yeah, Reed, this also, I think, relates to Kathy's answer from earlier about the distinction between the two different kinds of projects. I understood the design feasibility studies to be mostly to address the educational space needs. So the portion of the data that showed that we have classrooms that are too small or not fit for purpose, and a lot of them are concentrated in certain schools, those are the ones where it might not be possible to do any kind of renovation without totally remaking the interior school space, and therefore would need it.
Libby's got a question on that.
Yes, that's okay. And I think it's actually for the consultants. So first, I'm really impressed with the work. I'm just coming into this, I'm really impressed, and really handy to have. I think this kind of information really good to have. It seems to me when it comes to, roofs, HVAC, whatever that, you clear that the building's gonna work or it's not gonna work. That's pretty, when it comes to the space needs, so that's my question. So I think I heard Jeff say when the building was designed, it was adequate, but now it's not. Is that because the program has changed? And so the rooms are too small. Is that because the classes are bigger? If you mean the class is smaller, then the rooms would be big enough. I mean, I remember years ago when I was doing some of this, that we didn't have enough, rooms or space for schools. And then, well, if you increase the class size, you're fine. So that you can, so this is my question. So roofs and HVAC, you're not gonna wiggle, you gotta fix it. But it feels like for the space adequacy, and this is my question, if I'm understanding a little bit what's in the report, that really totally depends on your class size and the program you've got in there. So if you change that, you change the class size, you change the program, all of a sudden the space could be adequate. Is that reasonable? In other words, less.
Do you want to start? And I can.
Yeah, I think
Take it away, Jeff.
well, I think the thing is some of our facilities were built as open plan classrooms.
I remember.
And walls were
Before my
put in.
time. Not my fault.
but also put in, well, also put in and have been modified over the years until spaces are smaller than our current ed spec and what we need to teach the classes for the range that the board may set as the capacity of our different classrooms.
Right, but if the board changed the capacity suddenly.
Well, I think
I'm not-
they're gonna be within a range, 20 to 26, 20 to 27, somewhere in there. And that's what our sizes are based on. So, yeah, it could be a little tighter, but I mean, some of these places, some of these classrooms are literally not classrooms. And they're used as classrooms because the population grew in the building and they used the spaces that they had.
Right.
So that's where a lot of this comes from and a lot of its modifications over the years. And that's where we're looking at that type of concern. And programs have changed. And I think the other thing is we have a lot of smaller groups, we have a lot of breakouts, which don't exist in some of those spaces. So they took a regular classroom, cut it in half, and became breakout space and still a classroom. So like I said, modifications over the years to accommodate our current program have undersized things to the point that it's very tight to run a program.
For the current program.
Correct.
But if you went back to the old programs. And I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just saying these are HVAC are not policy decisions, roofs. You can't policy away the roof. But possibly what's going on.
The buildings have all grown in
Right.
population and modifications have been made. And I think that's where a lot of these issues from an education standpoint
Right,
have come and have shown. For instance, some of the corrections we're making right now are our kitchens were set up as catering kitchens, but we're doing full service cooking. So now we're having to expand these kitchens to create the space. It's the same as happened in the educational spaces, that it's been made do and it's been okay, but really it's not equitable with the other facilities that are, in the system.
Just on that note, that's what keeps coming to mind for me is someone's looking at Cardinal right now and thinking, my God, what a beautiful school. Or you go up to Discovery, my God, what a beautiful school. It's not equitable that we, wherever we are, don't have that.
Mhm.
I don't think you can policy that away either, but then the question is, you could do a major renovation and fix the roof anywhere, but you can't really do a major renovation and create that equitable two-story slide. Not that everyone needs a slide, but I'm just saying.
That's not it.
So the way, I know, that's what I'm saying. It's like, that's where I think that last box comes in, where you get into the equitable distribution. This is what we struggled with when we're talking about weight criteria or not. So that's what I'm really curious about is how that is going to play into the feasibility studies, because at least in my view, the feasibility studies are going to be on those things, not on replace the roof. Is that accurate?
Let me throw another thing in too. I mean, we start doing these feasibility studies. We're also going to look at the conditions of the roof. We're going to look at the HVAC. We're going to look at all of those things. And we may find through the course of the CIP is that some of those projects, we know we aren't going to be able to get to till the end of the CIP or to the next CIP, but we can improve that facility because it does need a roof, it does need HVAC, and we can make that a major infrastructure project to hold that building till we can get to it. So in that case, you're going to be pulling some things that may have thought about as full renovation. You're going to do some major infrastructure because the feasibility said, we're going to use this building as it is. We're not adding on to it. We're not going to make major modifications or changes. So we don't want to go in and put a new HVAC system in and then 8 years from then tear it down or rip down that section. And so we may find through the facilities feasibility study that we may end up, doing major infrastructure projects to bring it up to a better standard, but not finish it because we don't have the funding at this point in time. But we can improve it and raise it up on the scale.
right. Yeah, but some of them, again, you've got policy choices.
Yes.
I was amazed at 750 because we had 600. I mean, this is,
Yeah, I think I just to quickly add on, because I know but I think instruction has changed, right? And so if we looked at the way buildings were designed 50, 75 years ago, we would have one teacher standing in front of a class of 25, right? Sort of rubber stamped down the hallway. And I think what we're looking at now, based on more recent research, is things like for inclusion for students with disabilities, having co-taught classrooms with multi-tiered systems of support, having tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where you need to be able to pull students out with an interventionist to do small group work. We have OT and PT taking place in our schools, and we need rooms with that kind of equipment. So I think we're thinking about, and this affects not just facilities, but our planning factors work, right? That we're also going through when we look at our staffing models. We have to update in a lot of different ways, facilities, staffing, so that we are able to address the needs as we understand them today in our schools.
I'm mindful of the time, but at least wanted to get my one last question in, and it relates to Kelly's comment from earlier about the importance of, all right, so, you know, FAC and JFAC, we have work to do. Let's see how we can be helpful. I'm thinking about what I would do as sort of my next steps and as JFAC's next steps. You know, one will be to kind of open up the spreadsheet and start looking through all the red dots and figuring out how many of those red dots are, you know, for like on the facility side, relate to critical systems like roof and HVAC. And then for the space side, just seeing like how many of the schools seem to have space issues concentrated, and then help look at the underlying information to see whether those, you know, are like just the classrooms are too small and it would be infeasible to adjust with boundaries or whatnot. But that's a lot of the work for us to do without the benefits of a staff recommendation. And so I guess my question is there a possibility of getting the benefits of staff recommendation with enough time for FAC and JFAC to comment on it before it's presented to the boards?
And Mary, you had mentioned that there's a board meeting at the end of November where you had wanted to come back, at least comment. I don't know if JFAC was included.
The timing is that we will have a CIP direction that the board will be presented as an information item on Thursday, November 9th. So that's coming as an information item. Then after Thanksgiving, I think at the end of the month, it's an action item, November 30th. Thank you. So, you know, the next month is sort of a critical time period for CIP direction. But, you know, and there's of course the process between then and June when full CIP gets developed.
And for clarity, direction could possibly change between when it's stated in November and then when we actually come to finalization June, spring.
The CIP direction will be set and voted on November 30th. So then it's set, and depending on how prescriptive that language is, or whether it provides looser parameters, right? Then staff does its work to develop the CIP.
So on November 9th, for us at least, and I know we talked about this in our pre-FAC meeting, you'll put out a direction on the 9th. Staff will have published a methodology going back to, you know, the FAC and JFAC's work. And then FAC at least is gonna take most of our meeting then on the 5th. 16th, thank you. To go over the methodology and see what our recommendations are. And then on the 30th, one of us would stand and tell the board, am I wrong?
No, that's right. But I would say between the 16th and the 30th, it would be helpful if you guys can via letter or,
Yeah.
you know, pass your pigeon or something, get us your feedback, you know, as soon as possible after your meeting on the 16th, because ideally, if you say something that the board thinks about and says, wow, that could affect, you know, amendments we would bring or revisions to the direction or whatever.
Okay, so that'll be an action.
Sooner is better.
Yeah, that'll be an action coming out of our meeting then.
Yeah, that's true for you too. Well,
None of ours do.
for the JFAC also.
Right.
I don't think we answered Wellesley's question, no.
I think if he's at.
Yes, if staff could provide a prioritized list based on the methodology that we share. So I think we would need to
We would have to work and.
work
get back
with our
to
school
you.
board to see if that would be possible.
Okay, great.
We weren't dodging it, we just.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I think the public to me wants to know, like, where does my school rank and stack in the list? It's not that simple.
Yeah.
And so getting a simplified explanation out of how and why, so that back to the equity thing, you can't just make a policy change necessarily, but this is why this school goes for that school or vice versa. Sorry.
Sorry, and when you say prioritized list, whoever just used that word. At the cow last week, gave us a list of 10 schools for the deep dive, for the long-range renovation. Is that a prioritized list?
That was a list of schools based on the methodology that we shared. So we were giving you an example of what schools came out. We take the educational space deficiencies, overlay them with the FCI score, and we came up with those. We at first looked at 5, and then it was requested that we bring 10. So we brought 10. Were they prioritized? They depends on how you look at it. We looked at it from educational space deficiencies. So full transparency, they were prioritized based on that,
According to the.
according to the methodology.
According to the methodology, those 10 were extracted from the total list of 41,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But that list of 10, if I read it from the top, is that the highest priority, the second highest priority, the third?
I think so.
et cetera?
That's the ranking. Yes, they are ranked that way.
Are we gonna see those on the 16th?
Based on board direction.
13th, thank you, 13th.
Reed, I think the action item for us is to confer with our colleagues about whether we're comfortable sharing those lists more broadly than the meeting last Tuesday.
Because that was an example brought for the Cal for our conversation.
Yeah.
And I know it was shared out, but it wasn't anything that was finalized. We just really wanted to show you, if you applied the methodology, this is how that data will come.
So we shouldn't be talking about that as a chiseled in stone
Yes.
prioritized list.
It hasn't been chiseled.
So we'll take that back and we'll settle that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is actually 7:31. You all did an excellent job of staying on time. I do appreciate the conversation. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. It's given us again some more to go back and think about, not that we're not living this. And thank you again for bringing the owl. This is something I was introduced to this evening, and I think I want one of our team. That's an owl.
What is
What is it?
Go ahead, share the owl.
It's recording everything you're saying, Reed.
It's collecting your DNA.
Yeah, so thank you, Jake. Enable share. Thank you.
This thing is the light.
Yeah, that's the live.
County.
Thanks.